And if James can just confirm it is live streaming, then we'll formally get on with the meeting.
Thank you, Chair. Awaiting confirmation. Yes, we're live now, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, James, and good afternoon, colleagues from the Leeds City Region Enterprise Partnership Board and others joining the meeting virtually, as well as those who may be looking in on live stream. This is the last of our meetings before what we all are looking forward to, I'm sure, up and down the land in every household at some form of summer break, and hope it's a happy, sunny and relaxing one for everybody. Today's agenda, before I deal with apologies for absence, is, as always, looking to what we're going to be doing as well as what we have done. But one of the main items is an update and the analysis of what we've actually been doing as a group, this group and predecessors on the LEP board since 2013-14 in relation to the growth deal. So it'll be the centrepiece of today's agenda. So before we move to agenda item 2, can I ask you, James, just to rehearse the apologies for absence? And there has been a clash with another quite important meeting that was necessary, which means a few of the leaders haven't been able to join us, but we are delighted, as we always are, but in particular in this circumstance, to have Councillor Pandore with us to make sure that we are legitimised by being quorum. So thank you, Shabir. James.
Thank you, Chair. We've received apologies from Mayor Tracy Brabin, Councillor James Lewis, Councillor Susan Hinchcliffe, Councillor Denise Jeffrey, Councillor Tim Swift, from Kate Hainsworth, and Tom Reardon and Peter Mucklow.
Thank you very much. Okay. So having declared that we are quorus, and I'll keep looking at Caroline Allen to make sure that we remain so, Shabir, any declarations of interest that anybody wishes to share now, please indicate either electronically or with a hands up, and we'll pick up on those. There are none. Welcome, Mandy, by the way. I've welcomed everybody else. Exclusion of the press and public. There are no items, I believe, James, on the agenda that require such an exclusion. So the whole meeting will be conducted in public. Agenda item 4, before I seek your approval, having any comments or questions on the minutes of our last meeting on the 9th of June of this year, I just wanted to check in with Alan Rees, if not Alan, whoever else he might direct, regarding the follow-on from the public question time of our AGM and the publishing of the answers to all the submitted questions. So perhaps, Alan, you could just comment upon that, and then I'll look to see whether there are any other questions. Alan.
I'm struggling to see my Zoom at the moment. I apologize. Can someone just confirm verbally that they can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. So the questions that were received were all answered.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And published accordingly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Welcome, Simon. No need to apologise. I think we've all had a few connectivity issues there. So, turning to the minutes of the 9th of June, are there any further questions or comments, or can I seek your approval with the customary show of thumbs up? Would appear to be thumbs up. So fine, we'll take those as approved. So as I say, we're going to move into what is probably the most substantial of the items today, which is a retrospective, not a retrospective, but a reflection of the growth deal and what we've all achieved over the last 7 years together, but also, and importantly, as something of a benchmark to chart future progress. Now we are part of a devolution arrangement and have at last an elected mayor, to actually see how the cocktail of investments going forward move the dial on post-pandemic. Obviously, the previous deal wasn't planned around a pandemic. We've responded to it, but also we need to think about the next stage of our economic journey as we reimagine and put in resilience to the economy. So what's going to happen is that we're going to go through each of the priorities, and colleagues, I think, are aware that they've been asked to comment on that. But perhaps by way of introduction, before I hand to Patrick Bowes, who'll talk about how the evaluations has been done, and then Seamus in terms of the high level impact, and then we'll get into that detail, is to remind people, and I think I am still reminding some people, Rashik being one of them, and Ben, Angela, etc., that we set out a journey that, in rather crass terms, maybe anticipated if we took £1 from the taxpayer and we blended it with at least 4 from the private sector over and over again in the right range of things across our priorities, which we'll hear about in a moment again, we would hope to double our money in terms of long-term lasting economic benefit. The so-called 1 + 4 = 10 formula, which some people found rather amusing because it doesn't obviously add up, except when you explain it. I'm delighted to say in overall terms, and we'll get into some granularity during this piece, that 1 + 4 = 10 was actually surpassed, and it's somewhere around a 1 + 4 ++ towards 5 = 12, or 12.1 to be precise. So in a sense, we set out what we were hoping to do. We've now measured the economic investments, and it's calibrated, as I said. So I think that's a good thing, to set out what you hope you're going to do, what's on the tin, and then later find out what was in the tin, in a very sort of simplistic way. So I wanted to just extend my thanks to all of those on this call and beyond, officers, current LEP board members from both sides of the equation, private and public sector, prior members of panels, etc., for all of our collective effort that meant 1 + 4 = 10 wasn't just fanciful, but actually realistic and now evidence-based as we continue the journey of what I describe often as a new level ordinary, but could be seen as extraordinary economic growth, with all of the social benefits that should provide to all the people that make up West Yorkshire and beyond. So at that point, I'll pause and hand over to Patrick Bowes to take you through the overview and the evaluation, and then, as I said, we'll work our way through. If at any point you've got any questions or otherwise, if you could just intimate, and I'll do my best to pick them up. We're not constrained for time this afternoon, but equally, I do hope that I might be able to bring the overall meeting to a conclusion somewhere between 3:30 and 4, perhaps nearer to 3:30 than 4, but we'll see how we go. I think we deserve to do this sufficient justice, recognising the amount of public money that's gone in, but not least of which the amount of extraordinary effort that has been put in to deliver what I think is a very credible outcome today. But then I suppose I would say that, wouldn't I? So over to you, Patrick.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Sir Roger. So the board paper sets out the headline results from the growth deal impact evaluation. Just for background, the report was commissioned from a consortium of Arcadis, Genacon and ad specialists. Presented with today's board paper is a one-page overview and a summary report which sets out the high-level economic benefits and the return on investment across the 3 rounds of growth deal funding, with the assessment presented at the programme level and at the growth deal SEP priority level as well. The summary reports are complemented by a fuller 150-page report which presents more information learned from and through project and programme delivery, the results of a detailed stakeholder survey, and key learning insights and recommendations which will be used to design and support the future programme and project development. The approach used by the consultants follows the latest government guidance for subnational impact evaluations of this type, and has also been designed to work across different areas of policy in terms of the guidance that's published by government, in order to provide, if you like, a consolidated view of the economic benefits now and into the future, which flow from the direct delivery of growth deal projects. The report presented here today is the first part of a more detailed programme of evaluation of the growth deal, and was designed to articulate the headline economic benefits of the 3 rounds of growth deal, and, if you like, is akin to a mid-term evaluation of the growth deal using the available project output and performance information we have for the growth deal. The next stages of the growth deal evaluation will focus on looking at and quantifying the wider economic benefits to both communities and businesses in terms of their lived experiences and their business developments in the City region and West Yorkshire, and will include more detailed beneficiary and action research to help shape future design of non-transport programmes. It is also worth noting that this impact evaluation has not looked at the growth deal transport projects, which are subject to separate national evaluation arrangements. The next stages of the evaluation will seek to look at the economic benefits associated with both transport and non-transport projects in terms of looking at those wider economic benefits. I think it's interesting just to triangulate the sort of the core message of this independent report, which is that the growth deal has delivered strong economic returns and shows clearly the success of the LEP and the combined authority in delivering the 3 rounds of growth deal and the short and long-term benefits which the growth deal will deliver. This report sets out clearly the success of the LEP, the combined authority, and its partnership structures in delivering economic returns and benefits consistent with the ambitions that were set out in the strategic economic plan, and provides clear evidence that the scale of those ambitions were achievable and the progress of our partnership structures in delivering to these as well. So I think that just gives a bit of context to how we've approached the evaluation and more detail on the full report. So if that's all right, so Roger, can I hand over to my colleague Seamus, who will talk us through some of the high-level impact numbers.
Before you do so, can I just extend on behalf of the board our thanks to you and other colleagues for what I know has been a very thorough as well as challenging piece of work to present what we believe is a conservative view of our success rather than that'll stand any independent scrutiny, rather than perhaps fanciful narratives that others might deploy. So without further ado, Seamus, over to you.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Anna, could we just go back to page 4 to start with, sorry. Thanks. Patrick's covered most of the background and the context to the piece of research. So I just want to cover a couple of additional things quite quickly here. That the programme that we're looking at in terms of the growth deal were around 3 separate submissions that effectively stretch from December 2013 through to September 2016. Of those, put all together, they totaled £235 million, focused solely on economic development, as Patrick has referred to, and then further funding was awarded on top of that in terms of transport projects, which, to reiterate, are not part of the evaluation that has been undertaken. The investment that was structured around and within the growth deal was based around the 4 priorities that were contained within the strategic economic plan. So that was around growing businesses, developing a skilled and flexible workforce, building a resource smart city region, and delivering the infrastructure for growth. Within the growth deal as well, there were a number of targets that we signed up to with government. So they were around 19,595 new jobs, 2,300 new homes, and additional investment levered of just over £1 billion. And as we've already mentioned, this is just focusing on the urban regeneration non-transport projects. Next slide, Anna, please. And just, I'm not going to read through all this. I'll go through this in a lot of detail, but there's a few points I just want to pull out from this. Whilst we look at the different priorities, and as we work through the presentation, we'll see that we do get independent, effectively, evaluations and insights into the return on investment and the value for money delivered by each of the priorities. One of the crucial things we need to remember, though, is as with the wider economy, is that all the priorities and the interventions at that level are interconnected. So the whole really is greater than the sum of the parts in terms of the activity that's undertaken. But because of the nature of some of those benefits, they are not included within this evaluation. There's methodological difficulties in terms of just monetizing some of the benefits. And so we have to accept that, as Patrick has referenced about further work we might do, there are elements where we have impacts and benefits that aren't included in this, and we will look to how best we can monetize those. And I just want to mention, really, when you're interpreting the findings as well, and we're looking at the return on investment, we have to remember that this is over the lifetime of the benefits. So the return on investment has not been achieved already, but it will be achieved over the individual times the benefits are intended to accrue. So for some interventions where it's infrastructure like flood alleviation works, they may stretch over 100 years. If we were doing things like business assists to improve business in terms of innovation or productivity, then them impacts would be assessed over a far shorter period of 3 years. We'll also need to remember that some projects by their nature have a higher ability to lever in private sector funding. So for some projects where there is pure market failure that we might see with the flood alleviation schemes, for instance, where the private sector generally will not contribute to that because it's a public good, and the responsibility for funding those projects falls just about always wholly on the public sector. And for us, that means in partnership with local authorities, Department of Environment, Yorkshire Water, for instance. So it's those elements we need to take into account where we may not pull in external funding. Next slide, Anna, please. Linking back to some of the comments I've just made as well, what this slide illustrates, and it's quite dry, but if you're involved in sort of appraisal and evaluation, it's interesting to know. This is just providing us with, if you like, the rationale that sits behind the benefits that have been measured within this report. So for each of the priorities along the top, it's explaining what benefits down the left-hand side were taken into account, were monetised, and then how these accrued over the different projects. Next slide, Anna, please. So this slide effectively is the summary of the whole of the growth deal. So looking at all of the priorities, all of the projects in terms of the priorities, what did we achieve? It's important to recognise the nature of the evaluation at this point as well, that it was about an impact evaluation. So the brief given to the consultants was structured and it was focused. And it was really about what is the value for money that has been achieved? What are the outputs? What are the impacts? What can we monetize? And how does that compare to the costs that were incurred in terms of delivering the project and the programs? So for clarity, it does not go out at individual project or program level and do lots of interviews around process or how we could deliver it better or how we could be more potentially inclusive in some of the things that we do. But that is something we are building in when we do reference. So just working through in terms of the different priorities down the left-hand side. So the structure for this is really around a logic model. So we've got the objectives down the left. What are the inputs? What are the main outputs? The outcomes that follow on in the mid and longer term, and then the impact. So we just work them through quite quickly. Priority 1, we have 60 million committed to that through growth deal. And this is around supporting businesses. So 60 million committed through the growth deal, outputs around business support, jobs created, and then the outcomes. Priority 2 was around further education colleges. And we'll move on to each of these in the next slide. And all of these are capital projects. So the further education colleges, £78.2 million in growth deal. It was about floor space and skills. Priority 3 was around commercial and domestic energy consumption and making that more efficient and effective, reducing it. So inputs were 11.4 million. We're working with businesses and households, and there's a chance to increase resilience and profitability for those. And priority 4 was essentially focused around housing and regeneration. So over the whole of the growth deal, if we look at right-hand side. We have 45,485 gross jobs that are anticipated to be created. Of those, 13,000 are effectively new jobs and 32,000 are safeguarded. Just to point out, the large number of safeguarded jobs there are related to flood alleviation schemes and the protection of jobs within the areas that are protected. Those jobs then translate into 16,000 net jobs, which is the consultants effectively carrying out a calculation of how many of the jobs would have been created anyway, potentially. So it's 16,000 net jobs. Of those, the economic impact net present value, so the value today, is around 7.35 billion, alongside 2.2 billion of other impacts, giving us a financial total, and again, long-term impact of 9.68 billion. And therefore, over the whole of the growth deal, what we've done is we've looked at the economic return on that investment. And so for each pound of growth deal money invested, we lever in an extra £5.25 of private and public investment. And over the programme as a whole, it's anticipated that total return on public investment, as Roger alluded to earlier, will equate to 12.1 to 1. So for every pound it's cost us over the lifetime of the benefits, we should recuperate £12.10. Move on, Anna.
Thank you, Seamus.
Thank you, Roger.
So before we move into the detail and I go to Andrew Wright to talk about priority one and follow through with other colleagues, is there any questions, any comments that anybody wants to raise? I can't actually see everybody, so I'm relying on Julie and others to perhaps scan screens or indicate electronically. If not, we'll move on. Okay, nothing at this stage. So over to you, Andrew, on priority one of growing businesses.
Certainly, yes. We might have the next slide up, I guess, if just while I'm talking might be more useful than looking at my face anyway. But just a little bit more detail on the priority one story, and the background to this is growing business and recognising that SMEs are really the heart of what happens in West Yorkshire in this regional economy, and how we've really focused on that group in terms of putting the money in where it's needed. There are kind of four bits to this. Perhaps the most basic and important one maybe is supporting investment and expansion in those businesses. That's number one. But we've also focused quite a bit on encouraging innovation and productivity. I'll say a little bit more about that. And then more recently, we've also sought to encourage entrepreneurship to prime the pump for new businesses. And then the fourth category, very important, as was just made clear by some of the economic outcomes, dealing with major events. And the flood alleviation has obviously been a huge deal, but also Brexit as well came into that category. And we've been able to flex money and move money around quite quickly in this area. And that, I think, has been to the great benefit of West Yorkshire businesses. So if I take the first one, the first bit of it first, supporting investment and expansion in businesses. This is the real bread and butter of the growth service. We have 20 growth advisors across the region and 4 innovation advisors who are spread throughout geographically, and they are sometimes referred. If people approach us centrally, then they get referred to a local advisor. That happens. Sometimes local advisors are approached directly, or they do proactively approach the people in their region as well. Over the 7 years of the programme, about £42 million worth of grants have been paid out. Around 1,000 businesses have been supported. About 4,500 jobs have been created, up to 5,000 if you look at it in some ways. And we've also safeguarded 800 jobs as well with those investments. And the way that this evaluation works is that the paperwork that you fill in as you have to do an application for a growth grant, you have to show the additional money that's going to be generated in order to get the grant. So that's the numbers that have been used to generate these. And we do also audit that after time to check that they are real as well. So it's reasonably well founded. So that's been a very substantial bit of work, and I hope is work that will continue into the future. We've also been able to build into some of the grant criteria good work. So this is where, you know, as a special thing for West Yorkshire, really, we've said in order to get our grant, we want you to show that you've done certain things that will be beneficial to your business. For example, having a business plan or paying a living wage, or there was a whole palette of different things that you could sign up for, and some of them you had to sign up for all of them, and some of them you had to sign up for some of them. So that's been a little bit on our side. We've also run 2 productivity pilots, so not just having grants for creating jobs, but also for making businesses more profitable and building innovation and securing jobs for the future. I think one of our biggest jobs as a LEP is to be doing the horizon scanning and looking to what's going to be happening in the future, not just what's happening now and maybe what's happened in the past. And so this productivity pilot is very much about creating opportunities for the future, making sure the jobs that we're helping to get created are ones that are going to be well paid, long lasting and satisfying for people to do, so that people want to stay in the region. So that's mainly what I wanted to say. I will just refer to innovation lightly as well. Particularly recently, we've had 2 access to innovation programs. We've done a lot of work in connecting businesses to the excellent higher education institutions that we have in the region, one of our key strengths. I think they have been notably successful. And we've spent 2 biggest chunks of money on 2 wonderful assets, the 3M Centre in Huddersfield and the Nexus Centre at Leeds University, which have been notably successful. And I think sure colleagues would like to hear that. And I did hear the other day that the Nexus Centre was something that Manchester was jealous of, and they'd like to have one. So we always like to hear that, don't we? That we've done something that other people think are good enough they want to copy. So you know, that's good. And then the last thing I'll just say quickly a little bit about entrepreneurship. That's been something that we've probably spent a little bit more time on as a group in the latter part of the 7 years. And we have recently secured some money for a programme to continue the pilot, which has demonstrated that new innovation-driven entrepreneurs can be deserving of support. We can support them well. We can put them in touch with fantastic, already successful entrepreneurs, sector leaders, and people from the private sector who can really help, giving them 100 hours of help. And those first 15 businesses have done very well, and we're sure that what we go on to do will also be very good. A number of people on the call, I think, are aware of that, and that we're willing to secure that work and to do even more on it going forward in the future. So I think that's it, really. The anticipated impacts, I'll just repeat them again. More than 5,000 jobs created, about 2.38 billion of economic benefits from this particular priority. And in this area, this is the headline I'll leave you on, the return on investment is said to be 25 to 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And as with the subsequent comments from colleagues, I'll pause again, see if there are any particular questions that people want to raise at this juncture. Just look like Rashid does. Rashid, you'd like to come in?
Yeah, I just want to say that's phenomenal. I mean, the return on investment there is absolutely outstanding, and we should just take a moment to reflect on how far we've come. This is a journey that we've been on for many years, and achieving that kind of return, that number of jobs, is just phenomenal. So congratulations.
Thank you, Rashid. Shirley.
Yeah, thanks, Sir Roger. It was just a question about the land uplift calculation. And I'm not an expert on it, but I'm just wondering whether it's a challenging calculation to use, and whether it demonstrates sort of whether the impact has had any inequalities in that, using that.
Thank you. That's a good question. I'll perhaps defer to via Andrew to Seamus and
straight to Seamus on that one, Roger. Thank you.
So Seamus, here's the curved ball coming your way.
Well, I'll be honest. I'm not an expert in land value myself, but the way there's two ways of it working. There are standard approaches that we can use in terms from government that say how much certain land is worth in certain conditions, and then turning it into developable land, whether that be housing or commercial development. And there's also independent approaches where we might ask, for instance, surveyors to come in and do a before and after valuation. So it is focused just on the land value. It is quite a narrow approach. It doesn't take into account any sort of those wider equalities impact. So it is quite narrow, and I think it would have been a desk-based exercise as part of this evaluation.
Thank you, Seamus. Does that adequately address your question, Shirley?
Yeah, and I guess the point that was made earlier, that we're looking at the return on investment over a longer period of time, allows us to consider these things, I guess, in more detail as we go forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. Shabir, welcome.
Thank you, Roger. On that point, after looking at the report, I understand that there's going to be a longer term evaluation that's going to take place in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion. But if there's any quick wins that we can identify rather than wait later on, that we might be able to look at interventions to actually bring forward any learning points quickly. I think that might be a good way forward. Roger, thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Did you want to perhaps give a comment? I think
I can
important thing. If I could just clarify, Shabir, there's going to be a series of assessments that will build the whole programme. But as I've said, I was anxious that at least there was something at which we could begin to bench you and your colleagues, certainly long after my tenure, but beyond the current grouping, you could benchmark some of what you might decide to do together with us in relation to this and many other rounds of devolution that will surely come our way. Andrew.
Yeah, it would be good to drill down into the the results of those criteria that we put on grants. I don't have the figures to hand about which of the criteria were used by the companies as they applied for grants, but certainly increasing inclusion and diversity was one of the central ones where they were asked to comment. And so that maybe is something that we could follow up to bring you something that already exists, Xavier, but I don't have it to hand, but we could get to that fairly quickly. I think another one, just on that entrepreneurship point that we were touching on at the end there, that build pilot was 67% of the companies involved in that had founders who identified themselves as diverse. 50% of them were female, and around half of them were from outside Leeds. So there's some. I think you're looking for figures there, Shabir. That's some that I've got in my head, and we can probably generate some more.
Thank you, Andrew. Hope that addresses your comment, Shabir, and it's something we will be continuing to work on. With your agreement, I think we'll move to priority 2, skilled people and better jobs. And if I can, invite Rashid, who's led it throughout, or just about throughout on this agenda. And in fact, he's now the longest standing board member of the LEP, because he actually became a member in May, if I remember rightly, of 2013, as I became a member of the chair in July. So we will listen to our elder statesman with interest.
Now you're making me feel old. So colleagues, look, this is a really key agenda, and one that I've been hugely passionate on for some time. And what we focused on here was exclusively the buildings and infrastructure for further education, and not for the content part of the courses. We know that we're very well blessed with tremendous education staff and colleagues and expertise. So it's really the environment to make that learning effective. Projects we've focused on have been new buildings, improvement buildings, and also capital equipment, so improving the infrastructure. And we know without the growth deal, we would have either not had these projects or they've been scaled back. Much of the existing state that we had was deteriorating, and the impact is it's a detractor for learners. It doesn't make the learning experience that great, and the longer term impact is huge. So often we kind of think of the skills agenda as really the seed for enabling some of the growth and some of the things that Andrew talked about earlier. I would argue that some of that is possible because of the skills agenda. So 2 specific project examples I want to focus on. One is the Leeds City College in Quarry Hill. They had a number of constraints, and the funding actually allowed us to take what was a declining fabric. Some of the buildings and experience was far from acceptable, and we created a complete new campus. It's right in the heart of the city's cultural quarter. It's a state-of-the-art building. I've visited there many times. Some of the digital technology labs are second to none. We've got industry standard studios, theatres. It's actually been one of the primary reasons that we created the PTech program there. So Pathways to Technology, which is a globally recognised program. IBM kind of sponsored that and created that in the past, but now it's a kind of open forum. And the first site for that outside the US was in fact Leeds, and the campus actually made that really possible. The second example is Kirklees College in the Dewsbury Learning Quarter, and here the existing building on Halifax Road was really again not fit for purpose. We took a very ambitious plan that would create a much better long-term solution, building that kind of Dewsbury Learning Quarter, and it consists of the Pioneer Higher Learning Skills College and the Springfield Centre. The Pioneer House is a historic grade 2 Victorian building, and the restoration took on many of the architectural features. It created 3,600 square meters of modern teaching space in a historic and a really very unique environment, and that provides facilities for apprenticeships, higher skills learning, a lot of the sort of technology learning, creative, digital media. So it's been a very powerful and valuable space. Now, when we kind of look at the evaluation, the new buildings have absolutely created skills workforce, and that will have implications of value across the whole of the economy, and that's actually much harder to value. The monetized impacts include the increased learner numbers, the skills that are generated, and some of the direct employment impacts that have been possible. And there's a methodological way of trying to figure out the long-term impacts, but won't know that till much further in the future. But we'll capture that as the scope of the evaluation progresses. So the anticipated impacts here are 450 FTE jobs directly from this work, 574 million in economic benefits, and it's a 4.6 to 1 return on investment. So I think overall, this really is the bedrock for the region in having that skilled workforce for many years to come.
Thank you, Rashik. And just to remind colleagues, this was the largest skills capital programme of any LEP anywhere in the land. And interestingly, you use the example of the Quarry Hill site here in Leeds. The plans have just been submitted for a further development in Madbegate. Quarry Hill, the nearly £70 million development, of which the taxpayer through the local growth fund put a considerable amount into, was full when it opened. Such was the need, such was the requirement. So thank you, Rashik. Any comments or questions from any colleagues on that? Obviously, there's a lot of detail in the full report, should you want to go through that. But again, I think what we set out to do, we've done. Shirley.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, it's really brilliant to see the investment going into FE, and it was much needed. And if we can make sure going forward that the evaluation is so strong that nobody could question the fact that investing in the capital really does deliver these jobs, it's going to really pave the way, I think, to help people make stronger business cases in the region for when we're looking for similar investments in other areas of education, whether it's schools, nurseries, universities. So I think this evaluation going forward, I think, is really crucial.
Thank you, Shirley. And that reminds me also that I think uniquely, it wasn't a one-way bargain with the colleges in terms of, well, here's the money, go and build a new shiny building. It was also, there were delivery agreements where they were required, and we have monitored that they deliver certain outputs that we required in return for that money. And again, that shows the strength of the partnership, that it's, how do we optimize the use of public money to personal as wider economic benefits. So thank you, Shirley. If people are content, I'm going to move on now to priority 3. And whilst I think Mark Roberts is going to lead on the commentary, I'm conscious that, having only recently stepped down from what we call the Green Economy Panel, Simon Pringle, who's with us, he may want to add some comments, although, if he's happy to leave it to Mark, that's fine, but I didn't want him to not have that opportunity, because he has been, in fairness, a driving force that we as a region have very much benefited from. And I'm delighted his time does allow him to stay on the LEP board, even though he's had to step down from what was the Green Economy Panel. So I'm going to turn to Mark Roberts, if he's there, please. Mark.
Thank you, Chair, and indeed very, very pleased to be sharing these outcomes on behalf of the very many people who contributed to this really important agenda over the years. And I also wanted to call out Simon's chairmanship of the Green Economy Panel until recently, and with just messaging, I'm sure hopefully he will say something, following my update. But I guess just to talk to this priority, the context at the time of this growth deal, in successive strategic economic plans, we talked about the importance of measures to sort of help address some of these very serious environmental and climate challenges that we face. And whilst we hadn't yet declared a climate emergency back in December 2013, we did note that about 10% of our city region GDP leaves the local economy every year through the payment of the energy bill. And we also had a very strong desire to reduce energy consumption and reduce the carbon, and also increase efficiency. So for this investment through the growth deal, the objectives were to reduce the energy, water and waste consumption, to reduce fuel poverty in deprived communities in particular, and also to support the development of low carbon energy schemes. So in this priority, we spent 11.4 million in this priority area across the 5 key schemes that you can see at the bottom of this slide, and to which I'll give a couple of examples in a minute or two. I'd also just like to call out the overall impact of this for our city region. So 286 gross full-time equivalent jobs, about 200 of those would be net, about 700 million of NPV, of net present value of the economic returns, and I think a very, very pleasing return of public investment of 14.5 to 1, which I think is very significant in this area. So just to spend a minute or two to bring this to life, just to share a few more specific examples. So, the first one on fuel poverty, we estimated that fuel poverty affects about 156,000 households across our city region. And from this growth deal, we fitted nearly 1,800 energy efficiency and heating measures to about 1,500 homes, and also invested in the development of the district heat networks within Leeds. So that's about a 4.5 kilometre network, plus an energy centre and heat transfer station at Cross Green. And this programme is estimated to achieve annual CO2 reductions of about 5,000 tonnes per annum by 2023-24. And importantly, it should reduce notional fuel bills by between about 11 and 30%, which will help tackle that fuel poverty. We also invested in the Resource Efficiency Fund, so working with businesses across the city region to develop some proposals to reduce the amount of resources they consume and also the amount of waste they generate. So this started with an offer of a free environmental assessment for SMEs, and then a capital grant for implementation of some of those measures of up to £10,000. And that was matched 50-50 funding from the private sector. So, the summary, before I just invite Simon to share a few words, if I may, great to see the investment in this area, especially, as I said, the high rate of return on the public investment, 14.5 times, which is positive to the overall programme indeed, much driven by the amount of carbon saved, which I think is really encouraging for our future investment in such a key priority area. Now we have declared our climate emergency and have a lot of initiatives that we would like to support behind that. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. Simon, please come in and any further comments that you would like to make.
Glad to, thank you. And the first thing I'd like to say is really how pleased I am that Mark is taking over the chairmanship of this this critical area. And yes, I'm staying on the LEP board, and to the extent I can, I'm also going to stay in support of the panel, and I'll work with Mark and other colleagues to ensure continuity and to provide whatever positive input I can provide. So my stepping down as chair is in no way significant in respect of the momentum here. If anything, it's to try and add to that momentum and allow me to add value in a different sort of way. That's a superb rehearsal of what we've been focusing upon, Mark. So thank you for doing that. I'll just really point towards what this represents. What it represents is a starting point. It represents a stepping off stone. It represents a foundation stone. It's great. We should celebrate it. We should be proud of what we've done, but in no way complacent about what it represents. All it represents is a place that we can build from, and the challenges that we know we've got ahead of us to keep our regional economy competitive and sustainable in every sense of that word, environmentally, socially, commercially, financially sustainable. Will depend to no small extent on what we do next. And so what we do next is going to build on what we've done already. So I think we've got some great value out of this and regionally and colleagues, particularly various officers. So Alan and others have been celebrated for this, quite rightly, but what we do next is going to be really important here. And so I don't really have much to add in that respect, other than to say what we talk about in the next 6 to 18 months is going to be way more important about what we reflect on over the last 5 years, I think, in terms of what the future of this region is going to look like and how sustainable we're going to be across every definition of that word.
Thank you, Simon. And I hope that the minutes of this meeting will record this board's thanks, and we will be ever in your debt for all of the things you've done to champion this difficult but fundamentally important area. So personally and collectively, thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Roger. I genuinely appreciate that. Thank you.
So I think we'll move on into priority 4A, unless anybody had any further. Sorry, I should have just paused. Anybody got any questions on this before we move to Amir on housing and regeneration? No. Okay, thank you. So we're going to move to priority 4A, housing and regeneration. So over to you, Amir.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Roger. I guess looking at this was really a case of trying to demonstrate that the built environment actually extends across all of the priority areas, and I think it has a really pivotal impact across sort of what the aspirations are across all the priorities that we've just heard and the ones to come. And to that extent, the housing and regen element of this is really critical. The caveat that I think is got to be added is as so Seamus mentioned, the mechanics behind how the formulas of working out the economic impact here have been applied are, I think, slightly straitjacketing the process. And I think it's important to just take a slightly wider perspective before drilling down into the actual numbers themselves. But and that is to sort of, as an illustration, we did an exercise at my company a couple of years ago, where if we look at property prices in Leeds city centre for an apartment, the values can be almost 10 times or up to 10 times higher than property values for an equivalent apartment in Bradford city centre. And that leads to some really serious issues, because it leads to underinvestment, it leads to a very poor quality development or no developments at all, and that leads to then a downward spiral in terms of what happens. So the reality is that without this intervention, that downward spiral would continue, and the fact that that's not captured in the economic figures is a big shame, because that's a really, really serious sort of implication. And I think that ultimately the factor has got to come down to what extent do owner occupiers want to live within a place and pay the market rent. And by their presence, we then manage to achieve local stakeholders. We enable the private sector to follow on with developments because it's now commercially viable, and it stimulates that really important placemaking. And so the growth deal sort of funding has enabled sort of some very wide repercussions in terms of establishing values and setting benchmarks in that sense, in building confidence and creating momentum. But if we look at specifically sort of the factors that we're looking at through the lens of the economic formulas that are used, and we look at, say, a couple of examples. If we look at Bolton Woods, with which is an urban village, a sustainable urban village of 1,000 homes within a total of 3,000 Bradford Shipley Canal corridor. That's a really significant proposition that again stimulates the market, stimulates that wider area, and also builds confidence, builds relationships with the private sector, demonstrates the council's ability to deliver these things, and so on. So it's really important, and that's delivered so far 145 homes. The wider development includes shops, schools, health facilities, leisure facilities, and workspaces. And there were significant site constraints that meant that without this funding, this scheme would never have gone ahead. When we then look at the other scheme, Rutland Mills in Wakefield, and again, we've got a really prominent building next to the Hepworth on the waterfront, a really significant building, which if it isn't developed, it's almost a case of understanding what happens if it isn't. And that's where I think it is really important to see that, by creating something that stimulates a new type of workspace, which is including artist studios, art galleries, office space, hotel, restaurants, cafes, that sort of curation of different things enables it to act as a destination, which then enables things around it and near to it to also be stimulated, and it stimulates confidence from the private sector to follow on with other developments that they feel are going to benefit from that development's presence. And so I think that sort of broadening of the cultural offer in a place like Wakefield then also really helps to help with their placemaking. So in terms of the numbers, I mean, I won't read them all out, but I would just say that the 11.8 to 1 return on investment, whilst it's impressive and it's in line with and it's above targets, and it was, I was quite surprised that it was actually sort of, I think, the second lowest of all the priorities, and I was surprised by that. And when we looked into this, it was really the fact that we're in the situation of looking at what's not included in those factors. And one of the things that's not included is the construction supply chain. So you think of all the businesses that were involved in delivering these projects and all the benefits that has locally. Well, that's not included in those figures, so you can imagine what that would have. There's also the confidence factor in terms of how it unlocks the potential within an area and what might otherwise happen, and also sort of the visual impact of having large derelict buildings essentially in very prominent places. And I think that the values, the square foot values, increases that these can then demonstrate, then give confidence to the private sector. So that's kind of pretty much, I guess, a summary of the overview. I would probably just like to add a couple of points just in terms of where I think it would be really valuable as things are moving forward to look at almost a benchmarking or a litmus test of what are the market prices of buildings and developments that we achieve, certainly housing, that we achieve after 3 or 5 years of them being built. Have they helped to improve that? And to what extent are we ensuring that is a factor? Because that's what unlocks the private sector. I think the other point is around sort of having a defined policy approach for where we have failing property markets. And then the other one is really the catalytic impact that it has on the neighbouring assets and how that's factored into the considerations.
Thank you, Amir. As always, very thoughtful, very fulsome, but also forward-looking. So thank you for that. I'll pause again before we move on to see if there are any particular questions or comments people wish to add. I think we know that of all the other regeneration projects, you know, one or two of them dear to my heart, around the wider West Yorkshire environment as to what they've done, not only to the economy of those places, but importantly, point I think you made about the confidence of the populations in those places who perhaps have looked east and west of them at the metropolis and thought, why can't we be viewed in that way? And then they suddenly find that they have something that's internationally iconic and the only one left in the world, and all of a sudden mojo seems to come back. And isn't that refreshing to see, and to be part of that virtuous circle is very, very rewarding. So thank you, Amir. So we'll now move on to priority 4C, economic resilience. And I think you're going to come in again, I think, Mark Roberts. Is that correct? Have I got somebody else that's going to come in?
I think it's me, Roger.
Oh, sorry, Mandy, forgive me.
That's okay.
It's the MR, and I got the wrong MR. Forgive me, Mandy. Welcome.
But Mark, you can do it if you want to.
After you, Mandy, please.
Okay, I'll crack on then.
It would be interesting to hear what he had to say, wouldn't it? Unrehearsed.
Well,
anyway, Mandy, over to you.
Okay, well, 4C is economic resilience, but it's really about flooding. So for most of us, I'm sure that the flooding that we've experienced over the last number of years has been an inconvenience. I think I missed a flight on Boxing Day because of it. But for those people that it directly affects, it's absolutely devastating. It makes businesses and homes uninsurable. When businesses are affected time and time again as homes, it means that it really drains the commercial activity, but also the mental health of people in those areas. So doing something about flooding in our region is absolutely essential. And in 2015, the Boxing Day devastation galvanised the Combined Authority and LEP to go into action to try and put together a plan. And that plan was to increase the resilience of major towns and cities in our region, to unlock housing and commercial development from flood risk, which actually is an opportunity rather than a defensive action, and to protect businesses from the cost of repeated flooding. Those three major aims were underpinned by some secondary objectives, and those were looking at the road and rail infrastructure, which obviously has issues around flooding, but also increasing knowledge within the Combined Authority on natural flood management, which is something that can't be underestimated, and to increase the viability of communities that are prone to flooding. Nobody wants to live in an area that floods all the time, so we needed to change that. And so 20 million from the growth deal was allocated to this proposition, and we've actually spent 19.8 million of that 20 million. And that was garnered around internal and external groups, private and public sector. And the activities included things that were around flood alleviation, so approval of those flood alleviation schemes, around supporting schemes that increase the water runoff, and supporting schemes for upland management. And if you look on the slide there are 9 schemes that have taken place because of this investment. And those schemes are both hard and soft. So hard flood alleviation schemes, but also soft schemes. So if we look at the one for the Upper Aire Valley, that's involved partners, the White Rose Forest Partnership, it's involved the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, who are leading on the Upper Aire catchment. The National Trust is the lead agency for the works to the Cone and Calder catchments. Yorkshire Water and the Woodland Trust are all playing a part. And so those significant changes to how we manage water upstream will also help alleviate the flooding downstream. So those 9 schemes have resulted in more protection for housing and commercial land. Housing and commercial schemes being unlocked, as was the one of the objectives, and communities with increased confidence and viability. But not only that, we've managed to sequester carbon as a result of the upland management and improve mental health for our residences, which can't be underestimated. In terms of the investment, it's a strong investment of 12.6 to 1. and 34,000 jobs have been created or safeguarded. It has to be said that these figures are over a long period of time, not like the short period of time for some of the other priorities that we've looked at. I think the climate change report in 2016 reported £1 billion of annual damage. So the schemes here have been measured over a much longer period of time than the others. But I hope that gives you a flavour of it.
Thank you very much, Mandy. Again, I'll pause, see if anybody wants to make any comments or ask any questions against what's been the flexibility of the whole local growth fund approach to dealing with problems here and now as well as otherwise. Andrew Waller. Good afternoon, Andrew.
Good afternoon. It's a question that I've put before, is really to ensure that there's sharing of best practice across the region, because there will be experiences about upland slowing the flow that could be applied anywhere in Yorkshire, and it's ensuring that information is passed through. I appreciate the work of the Regional Flood Defence Committee, but it was just to flag that up as an ongoing concern of mine.
Andrew, I think that's a really good point. And when I read this, I noticed that one of our objectives was to increase our knowledge, but one of our outcomes maybe should be to share that knowledge. So I think that's a really good point, but maybe Seamus can pick that up.
I think you have made that point before, Andrew, and it's a very powerful one. And
yeah,
what I can repeat is that we will be as proactive as we can be, but we will certainly be 100% reactive when asked for those sorts of support. So thank you, Andrew. Was there anything further anybody wanted to raise before we perhaps move on? Thank you very much. Okay, I think we're going to now move to priority 4D, enterprise zones. Is this you, Melanie, or is this going to be Alan? I wasn't quite sure. If it's you, Melanie.
It's me, Roger.
Melanie, over to you, because obviously you'll be coming in a bit later on in fact, our next agenda item, I guess.
Yes, anyway, thank
Melanie, you can set the scene for that with this. So over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So in terms of priority 4D, enterprise zones, this is looking at the impact of the enterprise zones that have been designated across the West Yorkshire districts. So we also have an enterprise zone that's been designated in the centre of York. But this is just considering the impact of those within the West Yorkshire areas. So they were designated to attract businesses, to promote investment and to create jobs. And the schemes are unlocking key development sites that generally have been stood empty or derelict for some considerable amount of time. And the intention is that we would be able to create new commercial or industrial units that would then lead to job creation. And the main financial incentive for businesses to locate on an EZ site is business rates discount. And that was the incentives for businesses to come in. We had a number of individual sites that were designated, and the success of these sites and the successful development of these sites is very much dependent upon the effective collaboration between the LEP, the district partner councils and the private sector to find solutions for these very challenging sites. They often suffer from what we call abnormal costs. So that could be creating barriers to development, basically. Things like contamination. It could be a particularly challenging topography. We've got a number of these sites that have a very steep incline on the site. And, it requires intervention to develop, development platforms to then encourage the units to be built on top of those. And often there was inadequate access or no access at all to those sites. So they have been empty or derelict for some time. And it's fair to say that without financial support from the public sector, these sites would likely remain undeveloped in most of these cases. So we've had 7 individual sites that have seen some development during the Growth Deal programme. And actually we secured 20 million in Growth Deal round 3. Almost half of that funding we have invested in the Bradford Gain Lane site. So I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail. So the funding was 9.8 million to fill a viability gap on this particular site. And it occupies a strategic location between Leeds and Bradford. it does suffer from abnormal costs, as I outlined before. There was no vehicular access to the site at all, which did present a major barrier to the development of that site by the private sector. And the enabling development works and the infrastructure that's been put into that site, platforms that have been built, for example, it's enabled the development totaling £37 million to proceed. The site has created 12.8 hectares. There's potential for 316,000 square foot of business space, and it can accommodate up to 5,500 jobs and generate 37 million in GVA. So just that site alone is so significant. Astonish have taken one of the big units, and the other units that are completed have been sold to owner-occupiers, creating jobs for the Leeds City region. And just in terms of the evaluation, I mean, a key focus of the evaluation of the EZs has been around the temporary construction jobs that have been created, alongside the ability of developments to generate new and long-term employment. So we're looking at both of those aspects. Future schemes have the ability to deliver high-value, high-skilled employment in areas where it's particularly needed and contribute to wider benefits across the Leeds City region. And a number of these schemes can also then act as catalysts for further development on adjacent sites or regeneration activity. And that hasn't been monetised within the evaluation. So just in terms of anticipated impact, it's estimated that there'll be 2,720 gross jobs, 1,300 of those net. There'll be 682 additional GVA at net present value, and the return on public investment 9-1, which, given these are particularly challenging sites, is high in terms of that return on investment. So that's where we are in terms of EZs.
Thank you, Melanie. You made the point that these second phase of our EZ programme, having enjoyed the success of the first phase in Leeds Air Valley, are particularly difficult sites, and we'll be talking about one of them in the next agenda item, that have in some cases been several decades in people looking at them and thinking, what should we do with that? And we together have actually done something quite significant with 8 of them so far, and we'll be talking about the 9th one as part of that second phase of Enterprise Zone. So thank you, Melanie. It's not been without its challenges, but the partnership between ourselves and local authority colleagues, as well as the combined authority, has brought them all, or will, subject, as I say, to the next agenda item, bring them all to fruition as viable employment space for businesses to come, either grow here that are already here, or come here and grow further. So any further questions or comments or observations you wish to make before perhaps we'll move to the final part of this piece and then rapidly, hopefully, through the rest of the agenda? Okay. Now, Anna Woodhouse, recommendations and next steps. We've probably covered the question answer, but I'll pause again just in case there are any residual questions before I'll make 1 or 2 remarks, and we'll move on. Anna.
Hello everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Anna, and I've joined the Combined Authority as the Evaluation Manager. So I've joined quite recently, and I can't take credit for this evaluation on the growth deal, but what it is really gratifying to see is that much of the recommendations and learning in terms of influencing practice in programme design, delivery and evaluation is already being embedded. So the growth deal evaluation has been really instrumental in the development of a robust and cohesive evaluation strategy and implementation plan that my team's now delivering on. So, you know, for example, things like working closely with colleagues in delivery and policy, embedding evaluation within the different stages of the assurance framework. And I'm not going to read out all of the recommendations, but essentially, we've learned a lot from doing this growth deal evaluation, and that's what my team is now delivering on. I'm keeping it short because I know we're short of time. So in terms of the next steps, I think Patrick already mentioned this at the top, but we have got more plans for what we're going to do next in terms of the growth deal. And we're going to be looking particularly at questions such as who's benefited from growth deal interventions, what are the impacts for particularly marginalised and vulnerable communities, and how this work aligns with our commitments to equality, diversity, inclusion. We'll also be looking at the wider effects and impacts of work under each priority and really digging into each priority in more detail. So we've got some ideas for how we're going to do that. But if anybody's got particular things that they'd like us to look at, and I've been writing down actions of things that people have suggested as we've been going through, do get in touch if you've got any more ideas. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Again, I'll just pause, see if there are any residual questions. Shirley, you just indicated, Shirley.
Yeah, Roger, just quickly, I just wanted to ask, I mean, this is like amazing progress that's been made. And I wondered, when you're looking at sort of returns on this size, whether you did need going forward to present what the picture would have been like without the investment?
Indeed, I did actually, you may recall when we were in the Economic Recovery Board, and maybe that needs to change its name, but that's another story, about what the counterfactual might have been had we not done any of this, how far the economy might have gone down further. I see Patrick's indicating he may well have a ready answer to this, but there's something we did want to understand as to what sort of cocktail of things do provide genuine resilience, which is at the heart of your question. Patrick.
Yeah. Thanks, Roger.
Yeah, thank you, Sir Roger. I've just unmuted there. It's a very, very good point, and I think, Sir Roger, as well, you've also used the term resilience as well, which is sort of related to this discussion about what would have otherwise happened, and it is something we do want to look at in the next stages of the evaluation. We've looked at it at the moment in qualitative terms. So, for instance, if you look at priority 2 and the interventions that have been made through skills capital, some of the work that we've done in terms of the counterfactual has been very much around, for instance, the fact that the investment in the HE infrastructure effectively enabled, for instance, institutions like Leeds College of Building to offer courses that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to offer. If those of you who remember their existing premises, you will have realised that they were significantly constrained in the types of taught courses they were able to deliver and the types of techniques they were able to pass on to students. That has changed substantially at the new campus, and is obviously bringing significant benefits to to businesses in the construction sector. And it's those sorts of relationships that we want to go beyond the qualitative on in actually providing some kind of economic narrative on. And the counterfactual there is if the RFE estate, sorry, HE estate remained as it was, it would have collapsed into disrepair. And some of the strategic choices that we made probably wouldn't have been made by the Skills Funding Agency at the time. And so we realised we need to set out that counterfactual, both the narrative, the storyline, and provide some numbers around it. So that's definitely one thing that we do want to look at.
Thank you, Patrick. You remind me when I first actually visited Leeds College of Building on North Street in Leeds, and I thought to myself, so this is the College of Building in a rather rundown yesteryear building. Maybe their plans are exciting, and we should find a way of not only backing phase 1 but backing phases 1 and 2, which together we've done. So thank you, Patrick. So subject to any further comments, I guess 2 or 3 concluding remarks from me. First of all, as has been said, we believe that the evidence to date suggests something slightly better than we set out to do, but properly evidenced and at the lower end. And perhaps we can get rid of the screens, if I may, and the lower end of expectations. And I think we should take some confidence from the fact that 1 + 4 = 10 is rather more like 1 + 5 and a bit = 12. And secondly, importantly, to stand or fall by what we've achieved rather than perhaps see other reports which may or may not emerge that perhaps are a bit more apples and pears rather than apples and apples, as we've sought to achieve here. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to officer colleagues who've been on this journey with us. And you may remember we did have a little bit of an impact assessment before we started Local Growth Fund, which is where the 1 + 4 = 10 came from. And I'm delighted to say that 8 years on, it's still alive and well as just as a guidance metric, not as a precise measurement, or certainly not in any accounting terms could be scrutinised as accurate. Well, certainly not by me anyway. So I think we'll move on, if I may, to agenda item 6, which is the last one of the phase 2 enterprise zone sites, which I think Melanie's going to talk us through, and to seek your agreement as to how we, now the Local Growth Fund has concluded, how we might engineer that this one comes to full economic potential in due course. Melanie.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So yeah, the purpose of the report is to provide you with an update of activity on the enterprise zones for the first half of the calendar year. And obviously we just talked about the activity through Growth Deal. And then the second purpose of the report is to consider and endorse for the Combined Authority approval a proposal regarding the Clifton Enterprise Zone in Calderdale, which I'll come on to. So, I mean, the background, obviously, you've just heard in the previous report, we had a number of sites that were designated. Growth Deal was key in terms of getting a number of those sites moving and developed out, or certainly starting on that journey. We were also successful in securing getting building fund in the middle of last year. And a couple of those approvals were for 2 of the sites here that were enterprise zones. So Parry Lane and Langthwaite enterprise zones in Bradford and Wakefield district respectively are currently being developed out using the Getting Building Fund for those enabling works. And there's been significant progress on a number of the sites. I talked about Gain Lane with the spend through Growth Deal. We've also got activity at South Kirby in Wakefield, again using Growth Deal. Moor Park at Kirklees, there's been some development work done, and Lindley Moor West at Kirklees is now completely built out without the requirement for public subsidy. So we're continuing with Parry Lane and Langthwaite, and I guess one of the questions was what happens to the other sites where there may not be funding available. So just in terms of the other activity, at Staithgate Lane in Bradford, the private sector owner has now appointed agents to market the site for developer interest. And then at Lindley Moor East, Kirklees, so far the private sector owner has now initiated pre-application discussions with Kirklees Council's planning team. So hopefully something will be coming through there. But the remaining site here that we want to see some activity on is Clifton in Calderdale. And this is a 23-hectare site. It's the largest individual enterprise zone site within the phase 2 programme. And it also represents a third of Calderdale Council's employment land that's been designated in the emerging local plan. And it's the only EZ site in Calderdale. So it's of extreme significance to Calderdale and the wider Leeds City region in terms of developing the site and creating local jobs in that area. It's estimated that it will cost £35.5 million to enable the site for development. It requires significant public investment. There are on-site barriers. It's particularly challenging topography, access to the site, and the site is in private sector ownership with multiple ownerships as well. So it's very complicated. And Calderdale Council have asked if the LEP and the Combined Authority would consider foregoing our future business rates income on this site to allow Calderdale Council to then borrow and go through prudential borrowing so that they can start the work on the site. And they also have a pending grant application through the Levelling Up Fund as well. So there is a suggested way to actually fund the development of this site, but it would involve foregoing the business rates income. I guess what I should say is that unless we develop the site out, there won't be any business rates income. So yes, there is a significant amount of funding there to allocate, but unless we develop the site out, the income from that site would then be nil anyway. So it's seen as a way to kickstart this scheme where we haven't been able to access any other funding regimes in the right time frame for this scheme. And then there's just one final point to note, that there is some work that we're doing with the LEP network to try to extend the incentive period for businesses to come and locate on enterprise zones, because at the moment that does run out next March. So there's a few things happening there. and we wanted to update you, but also recommend that you endorse the combined authority that we allow the Clifton EZ business rates to be passported to Calderdale Council.
Thank you, Melanie. And it's a shame Councillor Swift's not with us this afternoon, because he would have been useful to have added his remark. But it has been, for the benefit of other colleagues who perhaps not as intimately involved with these sites as I have found myself over the last few years, probably one of the most difficult, but also one with the one of the largest opportunities, particularly its proximity to the M62 in that part of the country. So the recommendations are set out on page 40, but before I go to them, and also to make the point that this is not setting a precedent, this is to expedite the development of a very difficult site. And as Melanie said, without the investment, there won't be any business rates. And if Calderdale and others are prepared to take the risk of what is a very difficult site in terms of ownership, why wouldn't we want to see this come to fruition? But before I go to those recommendations, I'll just see whether there's any comments or questions or clarifications any colleagues wish to send my, or more likely Melanie's way. It would appear not. So are we happy to note the recommendations under paragraph 10.1 and 10.2 on page 40, and thereby endorse particularly 10.2 approval from this LEP board to ultimately get sanction from combined authority? Show of hands would be helpful. Thumbs, electronic or otherwise. That's fine. We seem to have that. Thank you, Melanie. We're now going to move to a governance update, and there is an additional point that I wish to address that's not caught by the papers, but maybe Caroline, did you want to start this, or do you want me to carry on?
Well, Chair, the report, I'd say very briefly, the report has one recommendation to the board. It's in relation to an extension of a current term of office for Colin Glass, who sits on the business investment panel. And that's a recommendation to the combined authority to extend that for a further year. So, Chair, I'll pause there. That's the recommendation in the paper, and over to you in terms of the additional verbal recommendation.
Sure. So before I come to the additional verbal recommendation, are people content to extend Colin Glass as set out in the paper? It appears some thumbs up are coming, so that's fine. Thank you very much. At our annual meeting, we proposed and agreed that it would be helpful to have as a co-opted member somebody, one of the business representative groups on our LEP board. Such a co-opted member is allowed through our constitution, and Caroline, if anybody wants to know, will reference exactly which is the paragraph or sub-paragraph or otherwise, or rule regulation. Perhaps I should know it, but I don't. That person, their tenure would be for a year as a co-opted member. And we invited the business representative organisations, the likes of the Chambers, FSB, IOD, CBI, etc., to consider who they might like to put forward. Unlike a full private sector member, the tenure is not for 3 years, it is for a year. That doesn't mean to say those representative groups, when they meet again in a year's time, at the ahead of the AGM in 2022, might decide the same person comes back for another year, or even another year thereafter. We also need to guard against what our objective was to get a refreshing and getting new thoughts and improve the connectivity now with our mayoral combined authority and LEP with the wider business representation group. Anyway, I'm delighted to tell you that the group has met and have proposed that Sandy Newman be co-opted to the LEP board. So it's her name that's to be approved rather than the principal, which we approved previously at our AGM. So I'm assuming there'll be no objections to Sandy joining us as a co-opted member, but perhaps again we could just indicate in the usual manner that that's the view of the group. It is. So thank you, and we will communicate that duly to Sandy, and we'll look forward to welcoming her to our next LEP board. So I think we are now moving to the home run. We might not quite get there at 3:30, Helen, so forgive us. And I'm not sure who's doing this COVID-19 update, because I think it was going to be Brian Archer, but I'll pause just to check whether it might be Alan Rees or somebody. Oh, Julie.
Be Henry, I believe.
Oh, it is. It is Henry. Okay, forgive me, Alan. Henry Rigg, are you there? And if so, please come and share
Rod.
comments you wish to make. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Sir Roger. Sorry, I'll just bring myself on screen.
There you are, Henry.
Yep, thanks, Sir Roger. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'll keep this brief. It's the usual update report. Obviously, I'm sure you've had a chance to catch up on this, and obviously the fact that the restrictions eased from earlier this week, having a positive impact on many businesses in our area. We continue to work really closely with our local authority partners who were doing the bulk of the work there in the table set out at 2.3 in terms of the grants, the restart grants and the ARG, the additional restrictions grant. And we're working closely with the local authorities to join that up and make that as consistent as possible across West Yorkshire, recognising that there are, of course, some different needs within different parts of West Yorkshire. But the grants continue to flow, and there are some specific elements now being worked on for the remainder of the financial year for the use of the additional restrictions grant, the ARG, which is looking at specific sectors, looking at supporting some of the bid organisations, the business improvement districts, looking to support the VCS sector, and looking to support some of those businesses that have been most severely impacted in terms of declining revenue. So that work continues. Just picking up on the entrepreneurship theme, I'll mention as well, following on from what Andrew was talking about, just to update, I've actually been assessing the tenders that have come in for our new business startup programme. The deadline for that was Monday, and we had a pretty healthy response in terms of organisations looking to bid to deliver our new £1 million business startup contract, which will hopefully commence September time. So we'll keep you posted on that. There's also a tender out at the moment, which is around pre-enterprise support, what we're calling exploring enterprise. And the tender for that closes actually this coming Monday. So that should be that should provide a flow through of clients into the startup program. That's work stream 1 and 2 of the entrepreneurship package. Work stream 3, which is much more related to scale up and high growth support. There'll be the tender is under development, and that'll be getting released shortly. So we'll keep people posted on that. I guess the other thing I would just refer to in this paper is from 2.12 onwards. Again, I think Sir Roger referenced this throughout on several occasions throughout the meeting, but that just explains the plans to refresh the economic recovery plan and to reconfigure and present that back to the combined authority. I think at their September meeting. So the information on that is set out at 2.12 and 2.13. So I won't repeat that, but I don't know if any colleagues from policy or strategy want to come in on that, but I think it is quite self-explanatory. So I think that's probably all I wanted to say on that at this stage.
Thank you, Henry. And also, on behalf of this board, can we send our thanks to you and your team right across the region for the extraordinary work that the Business Growth Service has done, not only recently, but on a sustained basis since its creation back in so long ago. I can't remember, at the Google Garage at Leeds Dock. So thank you.
2nd of July 2015.
Indeed, 2nd of January 2015. I remember it well. It only seems like yesterday. Sorry, you've got to go, Helen. Did anybody else want to come in? If not, can we just thumbs up the recommendations? Ben, you wanted to come in.
Thanks, Roger. Only to say that, because Henry invited comments on section 2, 12 and 13, just to say that the economic recovery revised plan, I think I think the intention from the board was that it will try and bear a stronger relation to the resources that we've got locally. So it'll be a plan that's more focused on delivery with the resources we've got, as opposed to the original kind of plan, which was a not just a bid to government, but primarily was aimed at a central government audience. So there's a subtle kind of change of purpose as well, reflecting also that we've the recovery out of the pandemic is now a critical issue for us all.
Indeed, and actually, I'll come to you in a moment, Amir, and indeed, is it timely to perhaps recharacterize this strategy as we are actually in recovery mode, and stop it's a bit like you keep reminding yourself that you were poorly rather than actually you're better and getting back to what you were doing before all of this. But perhaps that's optics, but for me it feels maybe we should start finding a different way to describe this strategic economic plan beyond the pandemic. Amir.
Thanks, Roger. I was just going to ask a question regarding the under the employment and skills support. We've got a BME representation, which looks really, really good. I mean, it seems like the participation levels are extremely high, which I think is fantastic. I just wondered about the business support and whether we can have the same sort of insights into the business support. I mean, given the amount of money that's been spent in the sort of that side of things, it would be really good if we could see something similar in terms of the uptake of that.
Okay, who would like to comment on that? Is that an Alan point or is that a Ben point?
So I'm happy to come back on that. So I think it's a great point, Amir, and the answer is yes. We are. What we're trying to do is make sure that every performance indicator and target that the LEP and the combined authority has got an inclusive growth kind of dimension to it, and we need to reflect that across all of our programs as well. So the answer is yes. The question is how quickly that can be pulled together.
Thank you, Ben. Andrew, did you indicate earlier? Did I miss? Okay, forgive me.
Roger, Roger, it's Henry. I could just comment on that as well, please, if that's okay.
Sure.
On some of our programs, we've got good data around businesses from where key decision makers are from a BAME background. So if we look at the BGP, for example, we know that about 12% of the businesses that have been supported are in that grouping. But we do need to replicate that across all of our programs. There have been some issues around GDPR and some of the restrictions that our funders have given us, but we need to find ways around that. So we're actively on with that at the moment.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you, Henry. As long as colleagues are happy, I think we'll move on to our last agenda item, economic reporting. And I guess I'm going to be looking to James Hopton and others. Are you there, James? Yes, you are. Welcome, James. Obviously, it's looking an improving picture. Let's hope it stays like that. But perhaps you and Patrick, you'll want to come in. Did you want to come in now, Patrick, or shall we let James start?
Yes, and there's a good reason for doing that, and certainly not to steal James's thunder, but just to sort of mention to the board that this is James's last board presentation. James has been producing the board economic report for the last 2.5, 3 years, and has the scars of making sure that our evidence and the reporting to board through the pandemic and has worked tirelessly, I think, to make sure that the evidence that we're presenting to the board is as up to date as we can make it. James is moving on to pastures new. He's moving on to work with colleagues in Kirklees. So I think, again, it reflects the strength of the partnership that our colleagues in the local authorities will continue to benefit from our investment in key skills. I'd like to just pass on my thanks to James for his hard work and maybe just recommend to the board as well that they acknowledge all James's hard work in making sure that the LEP Board has remained up to date in terms of economic evidence, particularly throughout the pandemic.
That's kind of you, Patrick. I was going to cover that, but you beat me to it.
I'm so sorry, George.
No, it's all right. I'm only teasing. I was also going to charge Shabir, but I'm sure he'll be very happy to let us have James's services free of charge from Kirklees as and when we might require them. But you don't have to comment, Shabir, because that was just a cheap shot from me. But look, seriously, James, you've done a phenomenal job, and we all salute you and wish you really all the very best. And knowing about the ambitious plans that Kirklees have for their economy, you will be good metaphorical bedfellows in terms of what their ambitions are, and your help to guide them through that. So without further ado, shall we just quickly go to the headlines of where we are currently, and then take any further comments and probably fairly swiftly conclude this meeting. James.
Yeah, sounds good, Chair. Thanks for that, and thanks for those kind words. But yeah, just to give you a few very quick headlines, because conscious of time. But as you alluded to before, Sir Roger, there's definite signs of improvement in the economy and a return to more normal conditions, but still some big challenges and uncertainties remaining. So the latest data we have from the Office for National Statistics takes us up to around the end of June, and that suggests around 89% of businesses are now open and trading, and that looks similar nationally and in West Yorkshire. So that's higher than it's been since ONS started tracking this at the start of the pandemic, but clearly that still means, despite the fact that most restrictions have been removed when this data was published, there was still around 1 in 10 businesses not actively trading. So I think that's a good level of recovery, but still a sign of some distress there. And the other thing that's interesting to note from that is that there's been a bit of a change in the sectors which are apparently most impacted by that. So throughout most of the pandemic, it's been consumer-facing sectors such as arts and entertainment, hospitality, and the kind of personal services such as hairdressing. In all of those sectors now, over 90% of businesses are now trading. But in some sectors, such as transport and storage, and some areas of professional services and information and communications, it's a little over 80%. So that's been a bit of a change that we've seen as more of the economy has reopened. I couldn't necessarily explain the reasons why. I think we're probably all aware of some of the challenges facing the transport sector, in particular logistics and driver availability and things like that, which may be a factor there. Alongside those businesses reopening, we've seen more people returning to their usual workplaces. As of late June, it was around 69% in West Yorkshire and around 65% nationally. So they've remained quite closely related throughout the pandemic, but there has been a slight increase, or a slightly faster increase, in people returning to their usual workplaces in West Yorkshire, which may reflect some of the sectoral makeup of the local economy as well, and the proportion of jobs which can be done from home. We've talked before about the data we have from a company called Geolytics, which looks at levels of activity in town and city centres. I think around the last board's meeting, we'd seen that recovering as restrictions eased. It appears to have peaked around early June and has then dipped slightly and then levelled off. So it's pretty comparable now to last summer. In most major town and city centres in West Yorkshire, it's between 50 and 60% of where it was prior to the pandemic. The exception is Huddersfield, where it's currently around 30% higher than its pre-pandemic baseline, and it's been quite consistent in that respect. So that's the kind of main 5 urban centres, if you like. But Ilkley and Wetherby are also currently seeing levels of activity above their pre-pandemic baseline as well. A couple of very brief headlines on the labour market. So the number of jobs furloughed in West Yorkshire fell to 72,000 in May, according to data from HMRC. So that's down 76% on its peak in summer of 2020, when it was over 300,000. But again, as we approach the kind of easing of the furlough scheme and the kind of winding down of that, that still equates to around 8% of jobs in West Yorkshire on furlough. More recent national data suggests it's fallen further, down to around 5.5% at the end of June. But again, that's still a significant chunk of jobs on furlough as the scheme begins to unwind. That said, recruitment activity remains relatively healthy in West Yorkshire, and the number of jobs being posted online has been above its pre-pandemic level for 12 consecutive weeks now. So there is a robust level of activity in jobs being created. And that's important because we've still got the number of people claiming out of work benefits around 85% higher than it was prior to the pandemic. Even though that's declined slightly, again, it's still a very elevated level. And some groups continue to be more adversely affected by that than others. So young people in particular have seen a sharper increase in unemployment since the start of the pandemic. And there are more people, increasing numbers of people who are out of work for longer, so over 6 or 12 months as we move out, and that becomes more challenging to re-enter the labour market. We've also seen business liquidations begin to increase over the past few weeks. So as of the 13th of July, it was averaging around 430 a week, which is about twice the level it was a month earlier, and is higher than we were seeing prior to the pandemic when it was around 330. That data can fluctuate, and it can, be influenced by external factors. So I think that's something to keep an eye on over the coming weeks, but it has increased a little bit of late. And the final thing I wanted to mention really was that we do our quarterly economic survey with the Chambers of Commerce, and the survey we've done for Q2 2021 showed a strong recovery in domestic activity, which was good to see, and I think supports what we've just been saying. Export activity was much more challenging, and businesses were also highlighting some significant challenges around a range of cost pressures, from material prices, premises, shipping costs. So all of those things were contributing to higher costs for businesses, which it felt likely will translate into higher costs for consumers at some point in the future. And the other thing we asked in the QES, the quarterly survey, was about businesses' return to work and what they thought might happen in terms of returns to offices in particular. And the headlines from that are that only a quarter of businesses in the service sector we spoke to expected 100% of their staff back in the office full time. Around half of businesses expected a hybrid model with staff in most cases 2 or 3 days a week. So I think that's still quite uncertain as to how that plays out, but it does suggest that for the time being, at least, we're not expecting to see a significant return to all staff in the office 5 days a week. So I think that has some big implications potentially for town and city centres that we'll want to continue to look at as things unfold, because it does remain quite uncertain how that translates into actual behaviour. So yeah, quite a mixed picture ahead of the final easing of restrictions on Monday, but some positive signs to pick up in there too.
Thank you, James. That's also, as always, very fulsome. Are there any questions or comments, clarifications anybody wishes to raise with James? And this is his last outing with us. Amir.
Yeah, so I'll just take advantage of James before he leaves. Just in terms of the economic reporting regarding the high streets of the town centres, their performances, there's obviously quite big disparities. Do we know what's driving those, or what characteristics are causing these to be the way they are?
So I think there are some big differences, and I think the big one that stands out is Huddersfield, and I think it's worth saying that jumps out on some other companies who are doing similar things. So I don't think it's just an issue in our data, as can be the way with these things sometimes. And I think it's fair to say that bigger city centres have taken a much bigger hit in terms of footfall throughout the pandemic, as more jobs done in those places have been working from home, and people have tended to stay closer to their local high street. And so I think that's a big factor in what's driven that. But I think it's definitely interesting that there's some of the places that may be more of a leisure destination tend to have seen a recovery of late. So the likes of Wetherby, Ilkley, and the other one, which is similar to those levels but not quite at the same level, is Hebden Bridge. So those tend to be places where people may visit on a weekend and things like that. So I think that's a factor as well. So I think it's a combination of people staying local and maybe people travelling to different places for leisure purposes, that in a different way to how they might have done pre-pandemic. but I think it's one of those where we'd like much more detailed data to really delve into it and see how and why people are making these moves. But it's a bit of an open question at the moment as to the detail, really.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Amir. So if there are no further questions, just a note for information, agenda item 10, the draft minutes for the last CA meeting held on the 24th of June. Our next meeting is scheduled for the 15th of September. I intend it to be an in-person meeting, subject to any changes that might materialise between now and then. Venue yet to be decided upon, because also we'll be having our away day conversations and perhaps beginning to help shape some of the thinking in terms of the deployment of the devolution deal and how that might translate into continuing as well as extending the range of activities. Finally, before I wish you all a pleasant summer, there will be some press around the growth deal, which has been the meat of our conversation today, and because it is our collective and collaborative success story, perhaps we need to make sure it reaches all the communities that we have individually to set fair the journey ahead as we iterate and continue to grow the economy of West Yorkshire, the wider city region. So, without further ado, unless there's anybody wishes to say anything, I'll just pause momentarily. Can I thank you all for the continuation of your contribution support, to take a collective pat on the back, each other and ourselves, as to what we've achieved over the last 8 years, and hope, as I hope for myself, that everybody has a pleasant break over the summertime with loved ones, wherever one ends up, and see you all back, as they say, bright and breezy when the new term starts in September, if I can use that educational narrative. But genuinely, personal thanks for me to all the officers, colleagues, partners. We've done this together, and we said 1 + 4 = 10. That was our ambition, and in maybe slightly crassly, we delivered 1 + 5 and a bit = 12. So what we said we'd do, we've done. Have we learnt lessons from it? Could we have done other things differently? Of course. But will that be a great foundation for the journey ahead in the devolved West Yorkshire and the wider city region that we all know and love? So thank you, everybody, and go safe.
Thanks, Roger.